Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 5th event of the Sheep Breeders Roundtable 21. Tonight's webinar is being hosted by AgriSearch, so we extend a warm welcome from Northern Ireland to everyone. My name is Edward Adamson. Some will recognise me as a regular visitor to the roundtable. I am a sheep farmer, NI, National Sheep Association rep in Northern Ireland, and I'm chair of AgriSearch Sheep Advisory Committee and will be chairing tonight's event. We have 4 presentations this evening on the theme of future-proofing your sheep business. RamCompare Feed Efficiency Study, lessons from 15 years of on-farm maternal sheep breeding studies, targeted selective treatment of anthelmintics, that's a bit of a tongue twister for me, ruminant carbon zero. So this webinar is being recorded and will be available on AHDB YouTube channel. At the end of each talk, if there's time, we might have a few questions. Feel free to submit your questions as we go along, and in fact we encourage you to submit questions whenever you think of them. These will be monitored by Jason Rankin and Gillian Hoy from AgriSearch and posed to the speakers on the panel when it's appropriate at the end. It's possible that more than one person will ask the similar questions, so they'll be grouped together into one question. To ask a question, you click the orange box in the control panel. You click on the white arrow to open the questions box and type in your question and press send. So I think we could go on now maybe and start with our first speaker tonight is Dr. Naomi Rutherford from Agri-Food and Biosciences Institute. That'll be AFBI from now on. So Naomi will be talking on the results of the feed efficiency trials conducted at AFBI Hillsborough as part of the RamCompare Northern Ireland project. Okay, Naomi, over to you.
Thank you, Edward. So yes, tonight I'm presenting on the RamCompare NI project, and I'm going to focus on the feed efficiency study that was conducted at AFBI Hillsborough. And just before it started, I'd also like to acknowledge my co-author Aurélie Aubry for her work in this project. Next slide, please. So before going on to the details of the feed efficiency study, I'd firstly like to touch on the RamCompare programme. Some of you may be familiar with it, but it's a UK-wide programme and it's aimed at evaluating the use of EBVs in sire selection and flock performance. The project has just finished its 5th year and has involved a number of farms from across the UK. And the findings from these farms have clearly shown the benefits of EBVs. An example from one farm is that high merit sires reduced days to slaughter by up to 29 days and generated an extra £7.86 per lamb compared to low merit sires. Tonight I'll focus on the Northern Ireland component of the project, but I would like to encourage you to visit the Signet website where you can find all the results from the project and some very interesting farmer case studies. Next slide, please. So estimated breeding values are a valuable tool in ram selection as they highlight the breeding potential of that animal for a range of production traits. As a result, producers can invest in the most suitable ram to achieve the desired breeding objectives of their flock. EBVs for production traits such as muscling, growth and fat depth have become more widely available in the UK and Ireland. And at the bottom of the slide, you'll see an example of an EBV table showing EBVs for muscle and fat depth. Past research, and now also the results of the RamCompare project, have shown that selection for these traits can result in improved performance. However, little is known about the link between EBVs for production traits and the feed efficiency of lambs. Feed efficiency of an animal can be measured as feed conversion ratio, and it's a measure of the amount of feed required to gain a kilo of live weight. A lower value is an indication of a more efficient animal, and feed efficiency is also useful in identifying animals with high maintenance requirements and is an important trait as it allows producers to utilise feed resources in a more efficient and sustainable manner, which ultimately helps to reduce the cost of production. Next slide. So the objective of the RamCompare NI programme was to contribute to the activities of RamCompare UK, Signet and the Sheep Ireland data evaluation systems by monitoring the progeny from high and low EBV sires from birth through to slaughter, and also supporting the development of existing and new EBVs. So this involved conducting 2 research trials at AFBI Hillsborough. The first monitored lambs from birth to slaughter and focused on performance and body composition. And the second, which I'll cover tonight, evaluated the effect of sire EBV for muscle index on the performance, feed efficiency, carcass characteristics, and meat quality of their progeny. Next slide. So this gives us an overview of the breeding programme that we used, and rams from both Sheep Ireland and Signet breed evaluation systems were used. We had rams of 2 breeds, either Texel or Suffolk, and then these rams were either high or low for muscling index. Muscling EBV is a measure of the muscle depth of the loin, and this EBV was the focus of the RamCompare NI project. So as such, all other EBVs were kept as constant as possible, and so that it was just the effects of the EBV for muscle that were being assessed. Composite ewes were then bred in 2017 and 2018 using artificial insemination, and the 2 years of the data was combined into one data set. In each year, a subset of 80 lambs were selected post-weaning, and they began this feed efficiency trial at a live weight of approximately 30 to 33 kilos. Next slide. So measuring the intakes of ruminants at pasture is particularly difficult, and at AFBI Hillsborough we have an indoor automated feed system, and this involves forage feed boxes, which you can see in the bottom corner, and these have weigh cells installed, and they also have an EID tag reader, so it records the weight of the feed that each animal eats on each visit to the feeder. The system also includes concentrate feeders, water stations, and animal weigh platforms, and this allows us to easily compare individual intakes and performance both within and between groups of animals. Next slide. So the diets and measurements then that were taken. Lambs were offered one of 2 diets via the automatic feeders, so either grazed grass only or grazed grass plus 200 grams per day of concentrates. Lambs were given a 2-week adoption period so that they could learn how to use the feeders before the experimental data was collected. And then over the period of a month, daily intakes and weekly live weights were recorded. And lambs were then drafted for slaughter at a target live weight of 42 kilos. And if they hadn't reached this weight at the end of the month in the feeders, they were kept in the same experimental diet then until slaughter. Carcass characteristics were assessed, and a meat sample was then taken from the loin and used to assess pH, colour and tenderness. Next slide. So table 1 shows the results for dry matter intake and performance. On the left-hand side of the table, we have the effects of muscle index, and on the right-hand side have the effects of diet. If we focus on muscle index first, you'll see that there were no differences in grass intake or total intake between the high and low EBV rams, and equally there was no difference in average daily gain or feed conversion. However, there was variability in feed conversion in lambs in both muscle indexes, and hence this shows that variation does exist. Equally, diet had no impact on lamb performance or efficiency, and it is important to note that these measurements were taken over a relatively short time period of 1 month, and that may be part of the reason why we aren't seeing the differences. This table shows the impact on carcass characteristics, and here we see that muscle index had no impact on carcass characteristics. It's also important to remember that this study involved 160 lambs, and that was a subset of our main batch of RamCompare NI lambs, which accounted to over nearly 1,200 lambs. And when we looked at the carcass characteristics of those 1,200 lambs, we did find that carcass fat class was 0.1 of a score lower for high EBV lambs. This table also shows that feeding concentrates helped to reduce days to slaughter, but didn't impact on carcass characteristics. Next slide. Sorry, next slide again. So the final results table shows the findings for meat quality. Again, muscle index had no impact on meat quality. The results for these parameters are all within the optimum range, hence showing that meat quality was good for both high and low EBV lambs. We did see a slight difference in pH for the two different diets, but again, the difference was small and still within the optimum range. Next slide. Although the effects of muscling EBV and diet within this study were fewer than expected, it was an important first step in assessing the relationship between EBVs and feed efficiency. Variation in feed efficiency between animals was observed, and therefore there may potentially be a relationship between feed efficiency and other terminal EBVs. But further research is needed to investigate the relationship between feed efficiency and these other commonly used terminal EBVs, and also to assess the impact of feed efficiency using other diets. Another option would be to measure feed efficiency over longer periods of time, and combining this data, we may be able to develop an EBV for feed efficiency. Next slide. There are a range of resources from the RamCompare NI project on the AgriSearch website, and these include handouts from farm walks and MART events. There's also a recording of our online webinar, which took place back in June of this year, and also the farmer booklet, which was produced, and it contains more detail on the project and also the results from the other study, which was conducted at AFBI. Next slide. And finally, I'd just like to thank all the funders and partners that were involved in the RamCompare project.
Thank you for that, Naomi. There's a lot of data there, and Naomi did show you a few booklets and things there. I would encourage you maybe to try and get the hold of them, make it easier to digest. Jason, have we time for a few questions?
Yeah, well, we've one question so far, and that is, why was muscle used to select the high and low and not scan weight, brackets growth, which would seem far more relevant to feed conversion ratio?
Yeah, I suppose there are a wide range of EBVs available. Muscle depth obviously is linked to carcass grade and conformation, and that was why it was selected for this project, but it could have been any number of EBVs. And also muscling is one that is more of a newer EBV that's available, and there would be less research conducted on it, so we felt it was more of a knowledge gap to focus on for us.
That's just the one other point which Bridget Lloyd has reminded us of is that the ROSA Sheep Advisors, you can get 2 CPD points for joining tonight. So if you want to get those points on the ROSA register, email Carrie Ann Hall at hdb.org.uk with your membership number so that can be registered. And that's all for now, Edward.
Right, thank you, Jason. Yes, thank you again, Naomi.
Thank you.
Just to introduce our second speaker for tonight, Dr. Aurélie Aubry from AFBI, and she's going to speak on the lessons learned from 15 years of on-farm maternal sheep breeding studies that AFBI have conducted these in partnership with partner farms. And it does, yes, it seems like it's been going on a long time. So there should be a few conclusions from that. So I just hand over to you, Aurélie.
Thank you, Edward. So yes, as you say, it's difficult to sum it all up and give it justice in just 15 minutes or so, but I'll do my best anyway. So yeah, just for today, I want to reflect on the research findings and the lesson that we learned by evaluating maternal sheep breeding strategies on farm. All along, as part of this work, a main focus for us was to improve the efficiency of the flocks. So on the picture here, you can see some of our ewes and lambs. They're actually from our lowland flock at AFBI Hillsborough, and you can see some of our buildings as well in the background. Next slide, please. I was clicking on it, but no, yes. Yes, as Edward said, AFBI has been working with lowland and in farms across Northern Ireland since I think it started in 1999. I wasn't there at the start, but back then the main aim of this program when it started was to help identify and develop more efficient breeding and management strategies. So back then it was probably less common than today for scientific projects to work closely in partnership with commercial farms. But yet this is a crucial approach, we think, because it really enables us to investigate strategies and prove that they can work under a different number of environments and conditions, and also it helps to promote the results and transfer the knowledge we gain from that to a larger number of farms. So this work was carried out as part of a series of research projects. So they had different objectives, but there were key common elements to them to make it work. So the first one is the fact that consistent crossbreeding strategies were implemented across the flock. It was quite important to have good communication and to have a link and a close relationship between the AFBI scientists who were working with the farmers to collect the data. At each farm, the number of flocks varied in size, but they each implemented the strategies on at least 150 ewes, which was part of their flock. Detailed records were obtained, especially at lambing, so that was quite demanding. And then presenting the results and the farming systems at farm walks was also often a key part of those research projects. But for us to optimize the resources in this, we were also able to investigate different research areas in addition to those breeding strategies. So for example, over the years, we had projects looking at different grazing strategies, different supplementation strategies. We worked with farm vets to look at different health plans, the benefits of using EID system, and we also compared different lambing systems. So quite a lot of data was obtained from this program. Next slide, please. So for today, I'd like to focus on just presenting some of the main results from a rotational breeding strategy that we carried out at 6 lowland farms for 8 mating years. I will then mention as well some of the findings we got from similar breeding strategies on hill and upland farms. And I will finish by highlighting some of the key benefits and challenges that this type of work represents and that we need to take into account in our current work. Next slide. So as I said, from the start, we did investigate a number of crossbreeding strategies, and the main aim was to deliver more lambs with less difficulty. And in particular, we have these rotational strategies we looked at. The aim was to introduce maternal traits, but also to ensure that we could deliver high lamb output to meet market specification, especially for those lambs that were not selected as replacements. So I've illustrated this rotation strategy in the figure here on the right. So at each farm, there were rams of 3 breed groups that were used each year. So we used a clean or a belle claire for their prolificacy. We also used Highlander or Romney for their lambing he's, and we also used Texel rams for their terminal attributes. So for example, if at a farm you had a group of ewes that had been born from an Highlander ram, when these were ready to be to breed, we would put them to a Texel ram. The daughters from this then would be, the best one would be selected, for example, using our Hillsborough management recording scheme. And then those Texel cross ewes would be then bred as ewe lambs or hoguettes to clean or belle claire if we follow the rotation. So in the process, then we'll end up with clean and belle claire composite ewes, and they would also have a bit of Texel and a bit of Highlander traits in them as well. So by doing this for a number of years, you can see here in the summary table, we were able to analyze data for more than 1,000 ewes per kind of main breed groups. So I've specified the numbers here. The farm number 6 at the bottom has a little bit more than the others, and it's because it was our own lowland AFBI flock. So we had on average about 300 ewes that we could include in the program. Next slide, please. So we covered some of those key traits already this week from other speakers, but just then as a reminder, as you can guess, we had to collect a lot of key phenotypic data. So as a reminder, it's very important for the ewe performance to collect ewe body weight and body condition score at different time points. Looking at we also monitor the scanning percentage, any health issues and reasons for culling. In terms of lambing data, we had the birth weight and the sex of the lambs, and we also had a scoring system to assess lambing difficulty, mothering ability, colostrum supplies, and lamb viability. And in terms of the lamb performance, we followed the live weight of the lamb from birth to slaughter regularly. We got the carcass data, and we also monitored any mortality numbers as well. Next slide, please. So just a few slides then in terms of the overall results from those lowland flocks. So the first one is the ewe live weight. You can see on the histograms here, so it's the ewe live weight at 4 time points. In blue, it's from the Belclair and Clean cross ewes. In red, it's from the Islander and Romney cross ewes, and in green, it's from the Texel cross ewes. So as you can see from that, the mature live weight at mating in particular was a bit higher for the Texel cross ewes. It was significant, even though, as you can see from the scale here, that it was not by that much. They were on average heavier by 2 kilos. So what we can say from that is that all those composite ewes had a moderate live weight, which was found to be quite ideal by most of the farmers. They were probably 10 to 20 kilos lighter than maybe a more traditional lowland ewe, such as a mule or a Suffolk cross ewe. And by having that lighter mature weight, that means that the energy required for maintenance are reduced, and there's also less chance of having heavy lambs that could be difficult to lamb. So that's a clear benefit of the strategy here. Next slide, please. So that second one, similar kind of 4 time points and the different the 3 groups of breed, and it's the body condition score. So as you can see from that, the Texel cross ewes maintain a greater level of body condition score, but again, the difference is quite more small. It was significant because we had such a large number of ewes, but the difference is quite small. If you can see on the scale, our body condition score here range from 3.4 to 3.8. So what we can rather say from that is that those composite ewes were in a good range in terms of body condition score. They were able to reach our target condition score for those time points. Interestingly as well, the variation that you can see here in the body condition score across the reproductive season was similar across the breed groups. There was a clear drop after lambing, and then it increased again, so that at weaning, you can see on the right there, the levels were similar to what they were at mating. So they were able to quickly gain their conditions back for all of those composites. So that was another key benefit here. Next slide, please. So this is a table here, one on the ewe performance and one on the lambs in the next slide. So first, this one is just some key performance data from the ewes. You can see in the table a column for each of the different crosses. So the top one simply gives the percentage of ewes that were in lamb at scanning. And you can see from that the barren rate was quite low, less than 4% on average. In terms of assistance at lambing, the Islander and Romney cross needed the least assistance, only 11% of them, compared to maybe the Texel, which needed a little bit more help, 17% of them. No very big difference in terms of lamb borns, reared, and the survival rates. If you look at the area I shaded in green here, so that's the total kilo of lamb that has been produced on average. So if you look at the total kilo of lamb wean, for example, it was lower for the Texel cross ewes at 48.2 kilos. And this, together with the tendency to have a slightly heavier mature weight from those ewes, meant that the efficiency was lower. And you can see that the last figure here on my table, I express the efficiency here in terms of total kilo of lamb weaned divided by the total kilo of the body weight of the ewe. So it was smaller for the Texel cross ewes. Next slide. So this table here summarizes the lamb performance again for the 3 different breed groups. So as expected, the lambs from the Texel cross ewes tended to have greater growth and slaughter characteristics. So for example, in terms of live weight gain in the green area here, on average 215 grams per day from birth to slaughter, compared to maybe 205 for the Belclair and Clean cross. So that led to a reduction in days to slaughter for the progeny from Texel cross ewes by about 8 days. And overall, really, what we can still say from that is that this is a maternal strategy, but again, across the breed groups, they still perform quite well from birth to slaughter. So that's what we wanted, really, that strategy to do as well. If you remember from the previous slide, I said that the efficiency of the Texel cross ewes was lower than the other 2 groups. And this is despite the slightly increased live weight gain you can see from that table here. So what we can say from that is that the number of lambs weaned was a key driver of efficiency in those systems. Next slide. So the key messages from the lowland studies then, from that rotational study, is that it worked quite well, in that the traits from the different breeds that we included in the rotation were successfully expressed in the progeny. Including a terminal sire breed in the rotation was beneficial, and that's useful to ensure good marketability for those lambs that are not kept as replacements. The barren rates were low across all breed groups. The Islander Romney cross ewes needed less assistance at lambing compared to the Texel cross ewes. And also the number of lambs weaned for us was a key driver of ewe efficiency. Because we carried out this strategy for a number of years, we were also able to look at, trends over time. And not only by, looking at different breeding strategies, we're able to improve things, but the fact as well that we recorded more data and that we selected breeding ewes based on performance data enabled us to improve flock efficiencies overall and over time. And in particular, when we did the analysis, we found that overall we increased the number of lambs by 0.2 per ewe, and also we reduced assistance at lambing by more than 5%. So we achieved improved performance for the whole flock. Next slide. So I mentioned earlier that we also carried some of this work in hills and uplands. We cannot forget about them. The previous work that we've done at AFBI, earlier work, found that the efficiency of crossbred ewes was equal to or superior to that of purebred blackface. And in particular, we obtained good performance results from clean cross and Swaledale cross ewes. So following from these kind of two-way cross-breeding strategies, we did also evaluate this same rotational 3-breed strategy on 6 hill and upland farms. So I illustrated this again on the figure on the right. The difference with the lowland is that we not only tested, this rotation strategy, but we also compared it with a second strategy, which was a crisscross between blackface and Swaledale rams. So, for example, at those farms, they had at least, again, 150 ewes that they used for those strategies. Half of them were through the rotation strategies, and the other half using the crisscross option. So, for example, a blackface ewe was mated to a Swaledale, and then the resulting Swaledale cross replacement ewes, when it was ready to breed as a hogget, was then put onto a blackface, and then we kept crisscrossing between the breeds. So next slide. So this is just single slide summarizing the key findings. So the table here represents the key performance data summarized and compared for the 2 different strategies, the 3-breed rotation and the crisscross one. And what we found from that is that the ewes crisscrossed between blackface and Swaledale rams were the more suitable for hard hill conditions. And this is because they could maintain a good body condition score. If you can see on my second row there in the table, the body condition score at mating was slightly better for the crisscross ewes. They also required less assistance at lambing. You can see in my percentage of ewes unaided, 90% didn't need assistance, against 70% for the 3-breed strategy. And also what you can see from that slide, we also found that those crisscross ewes showed a higher selection of heather habitats. So they were a bit better to manage the hill vegetation. And that was part of another project we did using GPS collars, you can see on that ogget there, and then habitat maps and habitat surveys as well. What else can we say from that table? You can see at the bottom in terms of efficiencies, then again still expressed in terms of total kilo of lamb wean per kilo of ewe body weight. It was similar across the two strategies. But when we looked into within each strategy, those efficiencies were highest for Swaledale cross and Highlander cross ewes, and this was driven by their higher weaning rates. So again here, we found a similar pattern to what we found in the lowland systems. Next slide. So based on this kind of work, to conclude, I want to highlight some of the main benefits and the main challenges that we need to be aware of when doing, when evaluating these breeding strategies. And in terms of benefits, then the fact that we were able to demonstrate efficient breeding strategies, what does that mean? We discussed that earlier. There was Sam earlier, I think it was on Monday, and other speakers. We mentioned several times that by having a more efficient ewe, you can reduce your carbon footprint for the whole farm. And there are key factors explaining this. So first of all, again, as we mentioned a few times, if you can lower your overall mature size for the ewe, then it means that you will need less energy to maintain that ewe. If you can increase the lamb survival and lamb growth, which we've been able to achieve with these strategies, then you will produce a greater kilo of lamb, so a greater lamb output. By reducing assistance at lambing, it's good for labor, but it also likely to increase the longevity of the ewe, and that means that then she'll be able to produce more lambs in her lifetime. Now, if you have for some farms, if you have a lighter ewe, then you might that might lead to an increase in stocking rate. You might have more ewes on the same area of land. So that would mean that your total methane emissions might increase, but your input in terms of feed and maybe fertilizer might stay the same, and you will also produce more lambs. So overall, when you sum it all up, all your different sources of emission, your greenhouse gas, when expressed per kilo of lamb produced, is often going to reduce. So you will lower your carbon footprint. Another area of benefits that we can have in the kind of purple area there on the top right is the fact that by monitoring these, by comparing your different ewe types, you will collect more data, and that will enable you to manage the system better by monitoring and benchmarking your KPIs, but also, and that's what some of the farmers found, that by being part of this project and knowing their system better, they were able to define targets and meet them better in terms of body condition score and nutrition, and that meant that that led to easier lambing. Lambing books were available to collect all the data, and that can be used to inform decision in terms of culling and replacement decisions. And that also then led to a more efficient closed flock system. Gains and improvements that we've been able to achieve at lambing were met not only because we used new good genetics, but also there was a change of attitude as well. you know, when being part of this project, when the focus is on the ewes, there was a tendency to maybe be more confident to leave the ewe lambing on her own and not necessarily give assistance when it didn't need to. Then as part of the project I mentioned earlier, we did have a lot of farm walks where we produced a lot of farm booklets and press releases. So that was a key element towards this project and a key benefit to a large number of farmers. And then lastly, because a lot of data is generated following strict protocol, the data is scientifically robust and enable us to investigate other key trends and management strategies. So for example, as part of this project and as part of these evaluations, we were able to compare, you know, castrated versus entire males, also the performance of ewe lambs versus hoggets, and to look at long-term trends and possible changes and improvement we could make for a number of other key attributes. Next slide. This is my last slide, and on some of the challenges that we need to be, you know, that we were faced by implementing those programs. So as you all know, keeping good records is challenging, but it's very useful, not only to monitor parentage and KPIs, but also to avoid inbreeding. In Northern Ireland, we're still limited a lot of the time in our ability to find recorded rams. And for us as scientists, when we want to investigate breeding strategies, the limiting factor is our ability to have enough funding for a sufficient number of years to monitor and investigate it properly. And that makes it even more difficult than to look at lifetime and performance and longevity. And this can be an issue not only for rams, not only for ewes, but also for the rams. And it's something that maybe we need to look into more, but it's difficult to do. It's also important to try and capture data at the whole farm system so that we can extrapolate the benefits at the scale of the farming system, and carbon calculator in particular are quite key here. And lastly, there's a need for us to explore new traits. So in the previous talk by Naomi, you can see that we're looking into feed efficiency traits. And then in the next talk, you will see that we also need to look at other traits to try and improve the resilience of those sheep. So just to finish, next slide, that's the last one. I'd like to say thank you to all the funding bodies who supported financially the projects, and also to all the core research farmers that were involved in this project over the years. There was a lot of time spent collecting the data, meeting rooms in Hillsborough to discuss the results and prepare the farm walks. So it was a very good partnership between AFBI and some of the farmers. Some of them are still contributing to other projects, and John Martin in particular, he's here with us tonight, so feel free to ask him questions as well. So I think I'll leave it at that. Hopefully I haven't spoken for too long, but there was a lot to say, so thank you for your attention.
Thank you for that, Aurélie. I think you did very well to get through that and be on time. Just a wee reminder to everyone that that Jason and Gillian are waiting there for questions. If you have any questions, just ask them now and they'll keep to later. You'll probably forget them if we don't get them down on the question box. And nobody will see you asking them, so don't worry, just ask away. Jason, have we time for a question now?
We have, we've time for one question. Was there a drop-off in performance in subsequent generations of crisscross ewes as they were no longer first crosses? Wouldn't we expect a decrease in hybrid vigor over time?
Yes, that is a good point. We didn't really notice a drop, and I think it's to do because we were still quite careful in selecting our replacements. So the progress stayed and was maintained. But yeah, it's something to keep in mind. So it's nice to to change and make sure you do bring new rams in the strategy.
Okay, as we're not at time there, Edward, so probably better just to crack on.
Well, then to give everyone else a chance, we better move on. Our next speaker is Professor Eric Morgan from the Institute of Global Food Security at Queen's University. Eric is joined by farmer, as Aurélie mentioned, John Martin, a leading sheep farmer from Grey Abbey in County Down. And Eric and John are both involved in a EIP, a European Innovation Partnership project led by AgriSearch, which is examining the targeted selective treatment of anthelmintics. Their presentation will explain the relevance of the project and give an insight into the experience of implementing TST, that's easier said, TST practices on farm. Okay, Eric, over to you.
Thanks for the introduction. I promise TST will be tripping off your tongue by the end of this. You're going to hear it so much. So this is an EIP. It's not as rich in data as the last presentation because we're early in the project. It's a project that's led by AgriSearch, but it has other partners, as you saw on the opening slide. AFBI are involved and CAFRI and all the farmers who are partnering, of course. Animal Health and Welfare Northern Ireland is also a key partner. So what I'm going to cover is the need for targeted treatment and the principles and practice. I'll show you a few results so far, given that we're only less than a year into the project, and then I'll hand over to John to speak about some of the observations of practical farm implementation and some of the pragmatic lessons. We're learning as we go as well in this first year, and those practical points are going to be very important. So we push on to the next slide. This is all really born of a need to deal with anthelmintic or wormer resistance, and we know this is well established and is starting to bite now. So this data is from a small study in Wales on 44 farms. It's a few years old now, and as you can see, 94% of those farms showed resistance to white drenches or benzimidazoles. When I say showed resistance, I mean that the reduction in fecal egg count following treatment was less than a 95% that we would expect. And we see that to a lesser extent for the other drug actives as well. When I say resistance is starting to bite, what I mean really is that if you have had resistance starting, you might still get 70 or 80% reduction in worms and fecal egg output. So you don't see a big production impact necessarily. What we're seeing now, as well as increasing prevalence of resistance, so a higher proportion of farms experiencing resistance, the percentage drop in fecal egg output following treatment is decreasing. And it's really hard to find a farm now where white drenches work to 95%. What is getting more and more common is 20% reductions, 0% reductions, increases in fecal egg count following treatment, as if the worms are feeding off the wormer. So where benzimidazoles are going, the levamisole, ivermectin, moxidectin groups will follow. We know that much from other places in the world. So we have to act now really to eke out more from these drugs, because I'm not convinced they will be replaced anytime soon. So how do we do that? On the next slide, the principle really is to target treatment. And what we're trying to do there is to leave a proportion of the worms in refugia as a source of susceptible genotypes. So we need some worms on the farm, whether it's in the animals or on the pasture, who have not experienced exposure to anthelmintic. There will be a reservoir, if you like, or a refugium of susceptible genes. They'll then mix in and interbreed with survivors of treatment, which are the resistant worms, dilute those resistant genes and allow us to continue to use those drugs for longer. So I apologize if many of you are very familiar with this principle already, but without it, the rest of the project description doesn't really make sense. How do we target treatment? Well, we can do it at the group level on the left there. We call this targeted treatment, or TT. We treat all the animals, so you might think you're getting rid of your refugia, but you do it in a targeted way such that you make sure you've already left some refugia on the pasture. So for example, you might delay treatment despite there being some fecal egg counts to make sure that you intervene before you have any production impact, but after you've managed to seed your pastures with some susceptible worms that act as refugia. On the right of the screen, you'll see individual level treatments, TST, targeted selective treatment. We were going to call it targeted individual treatment till someone pointed out the acronym wasn't great. So we call it TST. And there you see a graph of frequency, which is the number of lambs in this case, and then parasite burden on the horizontal axis. And what this shows you is that the majority of individuals in a flock will have very low parasite burdens that won't be impacting on production. We know this from practical experience as well. And the majority of the parasites are concentrated in relatively few hosts. And you see that in the circle on the right. Now, if we can somehow identify those individuals, we can treat just those, we can wipe out most of the worms, we can clean up the pastures for the future, but we maintain a refugia, a reservoir of susceptible genotypes to the left of the graph in animals that aren't suffering from those light burdens. So that's really our aim of the individual treatments. So everyone's a winner in that case, and it sounds very, very simple. Where it gets complicated is as soon as you try to apply it on real farms. So on the next slide, we have to think about the multiple indicators we could use to decide to treat. So we can use indicators of the parasites directly, and that would be fecal egg counts, for example. But that works best where you've got a relatively small number of animals, you have a high value of animal, it's feasible to take individual fecal samples and then target your treatment to those individuals shedding high numbers of eggs. And with most sheep flocks, that's simply not feasible because of the numbers involved and the handling and the cost of diagnosis and the time needed to get an answer. You can use it at group level, though, to decide to intervene at your selected level of fecal egg output. And that's more about the pasture contamination than the individual production. Secondly, we have performance indicators. The most obvious of these is weight gain. And again, you can apply that at group level, monitoring performance and deciding when you're worried about performance at the group level. You can combine that with forage availability. You can also use weight gain, of course, at individual level. So you have individuals that are underperforming and you can selectively treat those. And this works best where you have good handling facilities and ideally automated weighing and even automated shedding facilities where it can be applied very efficiently, but a high cost of capital investment. And finally, and much less talked about so far, are epidemiological indicators. It's tempting to focus in on the animal all the time. I think we tend to do this. We think about parasites in the animals, but actually when we worm animals, very often what we're trying to do is protect those pastures. Worm infection is a pasture-based problem. Granted, the infection came from animals in the first place, of course, but you're looking to try to keep those pastures clean enough to be grazed for long enough that you don't have to intervene. And we have much, much better epidemiological prediction tools now that can perhaps help us to achieve that. So in the next slide, we move on to the project specifically. The project really was about trying to determine which of these strategies would work best in a practical way on sheep and cattle farms in Northern Ireland. There are 7 farmer members, including dairy, beef and sheep. And the first objective was to define a suitable TT, so group level or TST, individual level strategy for each farm. And that involved interviews, surveys, anthelmintic efficacy testing was offered as a gateway, if you like. I don't know why I put it in French. I was speaking in France earlier, maybe that's why. But it's a sort of something to get the ball rolling. Most farmers appreciate that anthelmintic resistance is a problem for the industry, but often don't see it as applying to their farm. So this is a way of showing really whether it is a concern on the farm. And then sit down and talk about the management and try to create a tailored options for TT or TST application on each farm. We then got the farmers to implement this in the way that they thought best and collected lots of data on fecal egg counts, animal performance, grazing movements, treatments, and pasture larval counts. And now we're in a phase of trying to assess the impact of those strategies in the first year and go on to decide what to do in the second year. So on the next slide, we have some preliminary results. Actually, before that, I just wanted to show you an example of options that have been presented to farmers. We'd have 2 or 3 options that appear to be viable given the particular farms. These might include, for example, targeted treatment based on group pooled fecal egg counts, or on the right, targeted selective treatment based on individual daily live weight gain or weight targets. We'd outline the benefits, suggest how this might be applied, not being too prescriptive, identifying the possible risks and being honest about those. So in cattle, lungworm risk was significant. In sheep, there are risks around nematovirus perhaps, and liver fluke, and then how we can reduce those additional or collateral risks to ensure that we can apply TST regardless. So next slide shows preliminary results. The vast majority of the farms thought that rather than individual treatments based on either weight gain or diagnostic information, they preferred to go with group level treatments in the first year, and that would be on primarily group level fecal egg counts. The idea there being you take pooled fecal egg counts off the pasture, you don't treat straight away, you wait until you've got some evidence of egg shedding, you've generated pasture refugia, and then you can intervene at a determined level. In order to facilitate that, the farmers got FECPAC kits, which allowed them to do their own fecal egg counts, and we supplemented that with some additional diagnostic input, looking, for example, for other parasites. We also supplemented it by doing drench checks and fecal egg count reduction tests, and found on one cattle farm, for example, a 10% reduction with macrocyclic lactones, where we'd expect 95%. So that's a good conversation starter. In both sheep and cattle farms, the total number of anthelmintic treatments was reduced compared to the previous year, but target selective treatment using individual fecal egg counts didn't seem to be viable on any of the farms, and they weren't chosen. Next slide, please. So in future, what we're trying to do now is to assess the impact of those reduced numbers of treatments allied with sheep movement data on the likely generation of refugia spatially on the farms, evaluate those results and try to tweak our approach next year, collaborating with the farmers, of course, to see if we can take it further if it worked well, or if it didn't seem to work very well, to change our approach. And then to assess the feasibility and practicality of implementing these sorts of strategies across Northern Ireland more widely, and indeed across the UK more widely. And depending on how that goes, disseminate our recommendations and start on the KT aspect. On the next slide, I wanted to make a couple of observations on sheep breeding, given the context in which we're speaking today. Targeted selective treatment at individual level does lend itself very much to selection of breeding stock. Now you can see this map changing colour. I'm not listening to what I say, but I'll come to the map in a second. So in New Zealand, even outside formal sire referencing schemes, there have been great advances simply by choosing to breed from those animals that cope well in the face of worm infection. And this is based on TST, or as they will call it in New Zealand, drench on demand. Every time you have to intervene, whether it's based on performance or body condition or fecal egg count or diarrhea or anything else, you black mark that animal and you breed only from those that needed the least intervention. And that, I suppose, is resilience. And Aurélie mentioned it's difficult to define resilience. Well, in the case of parasites, it's not really. It's those animals that can cope with less help and fewer treatments. And they've achieved great things in South Island Romneys, going from needing 6 or 7 treatments a year in lambs to 0 to 1. We have to think, though, more about our desired phenotype, and I think this could be more, a bit more deep thought and a bit more future proofing around this. So if you think about selecting for low fecal egg count EBVs in a terminal sire breed, it's unlikely that benefit would be realized if those lambs are sent to market before immunity kicks in at 5 or 6 months. Whereas if that's in a breed that leads to maternal replacements, then that might be a very good way, if that reduction in fecal egg count is heritable, to reduce the periparturient rise in fecal egg output at the time of lambing. And we've shown outside this study that this works quite well in Exlana sheep. If we want to push the boat out further to future-proof this, it's known that in France and increasingly in the south of England, Haemonchus contortus is a big problem in sheep. This is a blood-sucking worm. It doesn't lead to diarrhea, doesn't lead to weight losses so much as anemia, and it can strike very rapidly. But in most years, it's probably not the dominant worm species. Climate modelling suggests that in future years, it might well become so. So perhaps we should be incorporating things like anemia in the presence of Haemonchus into breeding strategy, so that 15 years down the line, we've got the right phenotype for the conditions at the time. We need to think carefully about whether that's resilient or resistant and which parasites are going to be the main problems. Now onto the map. So pasture contamination mapping is something we've been working quite a lot, and Chris McFarland has been doing a lot of that work in our lab in both cattle and sheep. If we know the fecal egg output, we know the time on and off the pasture, the area of that paddock, and the weather, we can predict the appearance of third larval stages. And this map shows from February now, going into March, going into April, some increase in pasture contamination, and you see that build through May, June, July, August. But you can see great variation between the individual paddocks. The better they are, the more larval infection is on those. And that's really useful information. A drawback of selecting animals for resilience is if we don't know what the worm challenge is, then the weather is so variable and management leads to such variation in larval challenge that you could be selecting animals thinking you're selecting for worm resilience, but the worms aren't really there posing a challenge. Whereas in other years and in other individual paddocks on the farm, you can get strong selection. So you can gauge your performance around parasite resilience. So that's all I'm going to say, because I want to leave enough time for John to get into the practicalities of how he thinks this has gone in the first year and what he might change in the future and what advice he might give to the rest of you. So over to you, John, and the next slide.
Thanks very much, Eric. Yeah, that's a good overview of what's been involved and thinking behind the project. I suppose at a farm level, the implementation of theory sometimes is a little more tricky in order to get the outcomes that we hope for. I suppose we were a little bit late starting this year, so we haven't had a full season. So we've been sort of taking small steps, I suppose, to begin with. On my farm, we're lambing somewhere in excess of 700 sheep, producing about 1,100 lambs off 48 hectares. So we're heavily stocked with an intensive sheep system. So obviously, worm burdens are a key concern for me, and resistance to available anthelmintic drenches. It's not a question of if, but when that comes around. So what my intention is to try and identify strategies that can delay that cliff edge in whatever way is the best and most appropriate way to do so. I suppose the practicalities on farm, as I mentioned, the joys of trying to upload numerous images of dung samples with rural broadband can be challenging at times, and it's not the collection of the samples, it's actually the processing that a lot of participants found time consuming and maybe more difficult to get to grips with. But as Eric said, what we're hoping to do is identify a range of approaches across different farm types, dairy, beef and sheep, and hill and upland areas. And then lowland situations as well, things that can be used by the whole industry and can be adopted to improve or certainly maintain the efficacy of available doses and anthelmintic treatments. I suppose there's some very practical issues in terms of how do you record animals that have been dosed on a particular day and those that haven't. EID certainly helps with that, but coming down to a few tins of spray paint can make it much easier to identify animals if they're running down the race. But the system has a few difficulties, I suppose, and that, as Eric highlighted, there are some parasites that won't be flagged up necessarily using fecal egg counts. And on my own farm, for example, we lamb about 160 ewes in the middle of January to get female replacements. So they're all lamb to maternal rams. And at the end of February this year, we had lambs displaying symptoms of that I assumed were coccidiosis, and they were treated accordingly. Because it was much too early for nematodaris to be a problem. However, the symptoms persisted, and we did a dung sample, and lo and behold, we had nematodaris. So Eric and his colleagues, they have looked at that, and they believe it's more likely that that was a carryover of an infestation from stage 3 larvae from 2020 rather than a new hatching this year. So then the question arises, is it a different strain that's more persistent? These are the things. So sometimes you get more questions than answers coming out of the projects. I think another issue was in one of the dairy farms, and it applies to sheep and cattle as well. If you dose a proportion of the herd or the flock and leave the others untreated, are they going to suffer a growth check, or in the short term, but in the long term, will they benefit from increased exposure to parasites and therefore develop resistance more quickly? So these are some of the issues that we're beginning to flag up and to think about. And I suppose behind all of that, it probably indicates and suggests that a longer term approach to the research is much better, because you can give more robust outcomes and recommendations for the industry. So next slide, please. So I say, we're hoping to prolong the efficacy of drenches, but on a lot of farms, it's simply not on their radar. SCOPS is an unknown language to them, and people tend to just dose. Regularly online, you'll see chat forums. So what should I dose my sheep with? Whereas the first thing they should be thinking about is doing a dung sample or taking a sample to their vet. And as Eric highlighted, one of the things that I'm seeking to do or to get out of this project is to be able to help to develop a grazing plan that will allow me to manage pasture infection, along with multi-species swards, for example, arable rotation, and reseeding. So there are ways that we can attempt to reduce worm burdens. And I think, picking up on what Aurélie said earlier, the fact that animals that are challenged with heavy worm burdens are likely to have much reduced performance. Therefore, their methane emissions or the associated methane emissions are going to be greater. So I think that's all I want to cover at this stage. So thanks very much, and we'll pass back to Edward.
Thank you, Eric and John. I think at this point, just when we see what the farmers involved in these trials go through, I think the industry is indebted to all the farmers who take on board going through these trials. There's a lot of work involved there. How are we for time, Jason?
We just time for one quick question. For Eric here, are there any bag and post dung sample facilities available, but more vitally reliable? This questioner says they found local vets vary drastically in results and advice following results for treatment. That is, if they even provide a service, as he now finds a 60-mile trip. This guy finds a 60-mile trip going to one particular vet. So any comments for him?
Yeah, that's tricky. I mean, you can, in principle, post fecal samples, but you are relying on decent conditions, so good conditions. Otherwise, the larvae can start to hatch, and your fecal egg count is not reliable. And it's also tempting if you're posting not enough. So a lot of the postal services, the size of the bag they've got in there is just not enough to give a representative sample. So I would tend to advise that you find someone local who can do it well, or do it yourself. There are ways you can do it yourself.
A quick question then for John. What would you say would be a good daily live weight gain for lambs for birth to weaning?
Birth to weaning, you're probably looking at well in excess of 300 grams a day, and you will see a range across that, and that's down to mothering ability, milking, all those things in early life, the start that they get. So and the other thing I suppose that we've seen over with 10 years using EID recording, that lamb growth rate doesn't go in a straight line. and again, it comes back to checks with parasites, for example, nutritional, bad weather, those types of things. So you will see it's more of a step process, and sometimes it can go backwards. And that, and I suppose that feeds into part of the thinking around using live weight gains and weight recording as an indicator as to worm burdens. It's one of the elements of, along with fecal egg counts and pasture monitoring, that we can use to identify lambs that are under pressure.
Okay, I think we're against time now, Edward, so I think move on.
Okay, thank you. We'll call for Eric and John to come back at the end for a few more questions. Just moving on then, our final presentation this evening is led by Dr. John Gilliland, Director of Global Agriculture and Sustainability at Devon Nutrition. John's leading a highly innovative European Innovation Partnership project called Accelerating Ruminant Carbon Zero, ARC0 from now on, I think. John will be discussing the initial findings of this project aimed at accelerating livestock's pathway to net carbon zero, involving a group of farmers from Northern Ireland. And John is joined tonight by Roger Bell, a leading sheep farmer from Kells in County Antrim, who is one of the farmer members of the ARC0 group. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Edward. Can I thank you for the opportunity to actually share our joint journey, Roger and I. I'm going to sort of do this a little bit in two bits, because the one thing I know nothing about is sheep. The one thing Roger knows about is sheep. So I'm going to leave all the sheep questions to you, Roger, and I will do my best on the carbon questions. Also, within my presentation, I'll share a little bit about the journey I've been on with Devonish before we set up the ARC0 project, because it's about 5 years ahead of the ARC0 project, and it gives a very good reflection of the journey here. So I'm indebted to Roger and his wife, Hilary, who do run an extraordinary farm, and I would encourage you, if you ever get a chance, to go and visit it. So when you go on a journey like this, and it's really important you go on a journey like this, is that we don't look at this journey through one lens. We're under a lot of pressure as farmers at the moment. And it's important when we look at solutions, we look at them to deliver multiple goods. So what do I mean by that? Well, certainly, next slide, please. So really what we're encouraging people, when they go on this journey around sustainability, and not only economic sustainability, there are a collection of things that we as farmers do, we as livestock farmers do. One is, the key thing is we produce very nutritious food, which is fundamental to tackle human malnutrition. And we should never lose sight of that. But also too, we've a lot of other things that we do in our land. We look after the soil, and it may surprise you that certainly in most areas of the country that is predominantly either cattle or sheep grazed, our soil fertility, only about 18% of our soil is at optimal fertility. So we need to get our head around that. We also need to get around the fact that we as farmers are custodian of the nation's carbon. Really, we want to see how much carbon is out there, and could we put more carbon out there, and could we find a way of getting that measured and maybe get paid for it at the end of the day. And in doing that, could we also look at how we improve water quality? Certainly there are many parts of the country where our water quality is below par. There are many reasons for that, but one of the reasons is during extreme rainfall. Excess rainfall running off our land will take soil, will take phosphate, will take E. coli, and put it in the river. And can we get a handle around that? How we improve that? On top of that, can we look at biodiversity? On the particular research farm I lead, Douth in County Meath, we have an extra complication because we have a herd of wild red deer who do a fine job at eating all our trees, but I want my trees to sequester carbon so I can actually improve my carbon footprint. So some real challenges. And thrown into the middle of it, we're on a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And there are a lot of farms where there are ancient monuments on it. So really what we do is that we deliver multiple goods. So if you're going to go on a journey, and I'm going to focus for the next while really on carbon, because that's the one that's getting the most noise at the moment because of COP26 just finished. Next slide, please. And when we look at our landscape out there, and this is an image of many a landscape, but really what I've tried to do in this is just give people an understanding that there are a lot of fluxes of gases, greenhouse gases and ammonia that go on in our landscape. So at the moment, we as farmers are measured on the methane emissions that animals belch, on the methane that comes from organic manures, on the nitrous oxide that comes from wet soils, and the carbon dioxide that comes from machines or heating buildings. And that's what we call our gross emissions. So that's the total of all our emissions. But people forget that our landscape is full of plants, and plants photosynthesize, and when they do that, they lock up carbon and they release oxygen. Now, some of that carbon is re-released again when the animals then graze that grass and they belch out some more methane. But some of that carbon is locked up in the soil, is locked up in a tree or in a hedge. And when you add that bit up, that's what you call your gross sequestration or your total sequestration. So actually, the true position on our farms is when you take the two, you add up what you emit, you add up what you lock up through sequestration, put them together, and you get your net position. Now, currently, we as an industry are not reported against that. We're only reported on gross emissions, which is highly unfair. And we're the only sector in the economy that can actually lock up carbon. So really what we've been trying to do is how do we measure our net position once you've added both together and taken one from the other. Next slide, please. So how we've done it, and how we've done it in the ArcZero projects, which is another EIP innovation project, just like the one that Eric and John has talked about, funded under the same work stream. So for us, there's a big knowledge gap around how much carbon does a soil sequester and a tree sequester. So the way we've approached it is if we can go and measure all the carbon that's in our landscape, and then go and measure it again every 5 years, we can measure change. And if we can measure change, we can create an instrument that will actually reward farmers for the carbon they keep on their ground and the additional carbon they put in their ground. So to do that, we've used two different tools. So the first thing we've done is we've actually used a helicopter with a set of lasers that fly over the landscape, and they measure your landscape. They do 40 laser scans per square meter. A satellite will do one scan per 10 square meters. So a lot more accurate than a satellite. And it basically measures the topography of your land, but it also measures the trees, and you get a three-dimensional image there you see there of trees and hedges. And when we did this on our research farm in Devonish and Douth back in 2014, you can see the results there. We had 83 tons of carbon per hectare in our woodlands. We had 127 tons of carbon per hectare in our hedges. That might sound odd, but actually, as you know, a good hedge you'll not walk through because it's quite dense. A woodland, you can walk quite freely through because it's not so dense. So hedges are really good. The only thing I will say is you need many kilometers of hedge to make a hectare of woodlands. So what we saw then in Douth, we have 3,880 tons of carbon sitting above the ground in our trees and hedges in our farm, sequestering just over 50 tons of carbon per year. Next slide, please. So that's the above ground. Sadly, below ground, it's a manual job. You have to do soil sampling down to 30 centimeters. So again, this is work we did in our farm in Douth. And we did 88 soil pits, across the 450 acres. We mark them with GPS so that when we go back to repeat in 5 years' time, we can go back to the same spot. And when we did that, we actually found that our soil carbon on our farm was really low, a lot lower than we expected. We expected to be between 4 and 5%. And that we didn't expect to see, and has made us ask the question, why? And I'll come back and talk a bit more about that in a moment. Next slide, please. So when we did all those measurements, and then we took what they call a segregation factor from peer-reviewed publications. So you can see on the left-hand side, on our farm in Douth, we've got grazing ground, we've got woodland, we've got floodplains, we've got hedgerows. You can see the acreage. And then we've worked out then what is our carbon sequestration in our soils, what's our carbon sequestration in our trees. And you can see in Douth there's 128 tonnes annually sequestered in our soils and 54 tonnes annually sequestered in our trees. And that gives us a total of 181 tonne of carbon. And just a quirk of calculation, we actually, although we talk about carbon, the currency we use is actually carbon dioxide equivalents. So if you want to convert a tonne of straight carbon to a tonne of carbon dioxide equivalents, you multiply that by 3.66. So in Douth, we are sequestering on an annual basis 665 tonnes of carbon. Now that's a lot of carbon we're sequestering. So really what we wanted to see then, what would that mean at different livestock densities? And we have, and at 2 livestock units per hectare, we're displacing about 56% of all our greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide. So we've been on this journey in Devonish now for about 7 years. And so when the opportunity came 18 months ago to create a project in Northern Ireland, 7 farms came together. Roger and Hilary Bell being one of them, myself being another, and 5 other farms dotted around Northern Ireland. Some are dairy, some are beef, some are sheep, 1 arable, and in my case, anyone who knows me, I'm a willow farmer. And what we want to see is, could we do the same thing for these farms? So we want to measure the gross emissions. Could we work out the gross sequestration? Could we work out the net position for these farms? We then want to look at soil fertility. Could we improve it? Because we felt that if you have good soil fertility, you have better carbon. And then we wanted to see, could we improve water quality as well? So could we create what we call soil, nutrient, and pesticide runoff risk maps? And our partners on that are AFBI, AgriSearch, Devonish that I work for, Queen's University, and SRUC. So a really good partnership within the project. Next slide, please. So I'm going to focus now for the next 6 or 7 slides on the Bells farm in Kells, County Antrim. And we make no apology. We believe the journey to net zero starts in soil. And we believe that soil pH is fundamental. We think the problem that we experienced in Douth was our pH was atrociously low. So what the first thing we do is we do a really good rigorous soil sampling analysis. We did 25 cores and 2 hectares. And you can see on the whole, the Bells pH is really quite good. There are some fields need improvement a bit, but we're really trying to get somewhere between 6.3 and 6.5. Preferably if people are moving to multi-species swards, 6.5. Next slide, please. If we then look at phosphate again, we're trying to get an index of 2+, and you can see there, Rush probably a little bit higher than that. That's probably because of his stocking density, but it's still very good. And we use this to link with our LiDAR maps in a moment, which I'll show you to work out our runoff risk maps. Next slide, please. So this funny image that I'm showing you here is part of Roger's farm. The grey is really the landscape. It's like a naked image of the landscape. So the LiDAR, we've used the LiDAR technology to digitally rub out every blade of grass, every tree, every hedge. The purple spots you see there are along the streams. And those purple dots are actually where runoff water during heavy rainfall actually discharges out into the stream. The yellow lines are actually where does the water gather and run towards the stream. So if you're going to reduce the amount of silt or clay or phosphate that's going in, you know exactly where does that water run off. Next slide, please. The additional red on this is adding in what we call the critical source areas for phosphate. So this is where the soil phosphate index is high, and that adds then, that gives a potential higher risk to the runoff then. Now what you will also see in this map of Rogers is that there's a lot of grey areas with no yellow lines or red lines. So actually if you're going to spread slurry as soon as the close period is finished, there are a lot of places you can spread slurry with no or little risk of runoff. So it helps you to decide where do you spread your slurry, or where is the driest part of the land. Next slide, please. So the next thing we did is we went to SRUC in Scotland and we engaged there. They have a life cycle assessment calculator called AgriCalc. And so all 7 farms have now gone through AgriCalc. And Roger has very kindly given permission for me to show the results of his farm having gone through the calculator. So when you go through the calculator, what you will see on the left-hand side is the figure of the whole farm. So that is the total greenhouse gas emissions for the whole farm. And then to the right-hand side, you can see that it's been divided into the 2 enterprises that Roger has. Roger is predominantly a sheep farmer, but he has some beef. And so you can see how the whole farm is divided per enterprise there. Next slide, please. You can see then when you do the whole total, that in Roger's case on carbon dioxide, remember that's only one of the 3 greenhouse gas emissions, he's producing 143.9 tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. Next slide, please. And then we go and look at methane. So the methane results come from enteric fermentation, in other words, from the gut of the sheep or the cow, and from manure management. And you can see most of that comes from really from belching of the animal as such. You can see how much comes of methane. Next slide. And you can see at the bottom nitrous oxide. And the reason these 2 are important is methane is 28 times more toxic than carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide is 296 times more toxic. And that is coming from nitrogen on wet soils as such. So really we need to try and address how we stop, either reduce the water in our soils or only put on nitrogen on when the soils are dry. Next slide, please. So when you go through the calculator then and you start to get the results, what happens then is they benchmark Roger's farm against other farms then. So you can see these are Roger's results. You can see the results for the sheep enterprise and the results for the beef enterprise. And you work down and you get a figure of greenhouse gas emissions per kilo of sheep meat there at 21.9 and for beef 33. And then you can see the benchmark. You can see the number of farms that he's been benchmarked against, and then you can see your result against the average benchmark. And what you're seeing on Roger's sheep enterprise, it's stunning. On his beef enterprise, with a bit more work to do. But you can see exactly where those issues need to be addressed. Next slide, please. So what you then get, and you add all this up, is you get Roger's gross emissions. Remember, that is the adding up of the carbon dioxide emissions, the methane emissions, and the nitrous oxide emissions. Next slide. But then I want to go to what he actually locks up in the grass, in the soil, in the trees and hedges. And using the Agri-calculator, I do put a health warning on this. This part of the calculator is quite crude because it's new science as such. It only uses what they call tier 1 segregation, and it is adjusted for the organic manures that Roger puts on his farm. But you can see there that while his gross emissions were 820 tonnes, he is sequestering 450 tonnes. To leave him, next slide please. To leave him then with his net emission of 364 tonnes. So in other words, on Roger and Hillary's farm, they are reducing their footprint by 56% just by what is happening in the soil, in the trees and in the hedges, with the health warning that this is only tier 1 segregation and we hope to get to tier 2 and then to tier 3. Next slide, please. So we want to delve a bit more into the carbon that is on Roger's farm, but we also want to understand what land uses and what decisions that we make on a daily basis leave us with the most carbon and what leaves us with the least amount of carbon in our soils. And so in the EIP project that we are doing is we have divided Roger's farm up into 2 hectare or 5 acre blocks digitally. And in the springtime, we went out to measure pH, pK, calcium, magnesium, and soil organic matter or loss of ignition. So the very first question, we then went back out and we sampled again in July and August to measure his soil carbon. But to decide where we were going to sample, we actually categorized his land. And we categorized it against these 6 questions. What is the current soil organic matter? Is it 0 to 10%, 10 to 20%, 20 to 30%, or 30% and greater? In other words, a peat soil. What is the land being used for? Is it grass? Is it arable? Is it woodland? Have it had organic manures? And if it has, is it slurry? Is it farmyard manure? Is it compost? In the case of grassland, is it permanent or rotational grass? Is it cut? Is it grazed? Or is it both cut and grazed? In the case of rotational grass, we asked, is it predominantly perennial ryegrass, or is it a multi-species or herbal ley? And in the case of woodland, is it deciduous? Is it coniferous? Is it short rotation willow? Or is it silver pasture agroforestry? So we really, this is the first time this has ever been done, and we really stratified the land use and land management. Next slide, please. So off a gentleman called Josh from a company called RPS went, and he spent 2 months sampling 950 hectares, including Roger and Hillary's farm, and every point was marked with GPS, and he augured down to 30 centimeters. I don't think he had as much muscles when he started. He certainly did when he finished. The soil was incredibly hard during July. If anyone remembers, it was quite warm. Next slide, please. So this is the initial appraisal of the results we got from Hillary and Roger's farm. You can see on the left-hand side just the scale of land categorization that we've done. So you can see the 10 to 20% soil organic matter, permanent grass, no slurry or farmyard manure, and only grazed. And you can see the whole way down to greater than 30% soil organic matter, permanent grass, slurry, farmyard manure, and only grazed. And you can see the acreage in each one of those categories. You can see the soil organic matter percentage that we got in the February sampling. And then in our July sampling, you can see the number of soil cores we did, the number of composite samples we did. And then unusually, I said in the Douth work, we sampled 0 to 30 centimeters, which is what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change wants you to do. But we also did 0 to 10 centimeters because we wanted to see where was the carbon sitting in the soil. Next slide, please. The other thing we did is we also, when we took these samples, we actually analyzed the soil for what we call a soil texture classification. If you take a soil, it has 4 key components. It has organic matter, which carbon sits in. It's got clay, it's got sand, and it's got silt. So when you take a soil and you take out the organic matter and carbon, what you're left then is a mixture of sand, silt, and clay. This is important because the more clay you've got, the more carbon you can hold. And it also allows us to compare between the amount of carbon in each one of his categories. Are we actually comparing apples to apples or apples with oranges? And what you're seeing in Roger's farm is he has 2 key types of soil there. Most of it is the sort of silty clay, silty clay loam and clay loam. And in a small bit of it is the sandy loam and silty loam. And they behave in different ways. Next slide, please. So when we delve into it, one of the things I just want to draw to your attention is Roger and Hilary have been experimenting with herbal A's and multi-species swards now a couple of years. And the area that I've highlighted here is just doing a direct comparison of rotational grass, one with perennial ryegrass, one with multi-species sward. Both get slurry and farmyard manure and both are grazed. And what we saw in the springtime is their soil organic matter, one was 16.9%, one was 16.1%. But when you go and look at the 0 to 10 and the 0 to 30, what you're seeing is that actually at 0 to 30, the multi-species swards has a lot more carbon deeper. In other words, the multi-species swards has very long roots. The herbs, the legumes are going down deeper, they're laying carbon down deeper. And we can see that very clear in Roger's example here, where the rotational grass with perennial ryegrass is sitting at 5.4% at 0 to 30 centimeters, but the multi-species sward sitting at 7.3. So a clear indication that multi-species swards are expected to dramatically increase the amount of carbon in your soil. Next slide, please. And the last thing before I move on is I just want to flag up just the quantity of carbon that Roger and Hilary have in the top 30 centimeters. He has 13,885 tons of carbon. I want to labor that because at the moment, our industry is being pulled through the gutters by the press. What they don't realize is we are actually the custodians of the nation's carbon. And actually, they need to look after us, not beat the living daylights out of us. And this just gives you an understanding of how much carbon is potentially on each farm and what we as farmers are looking after. Next slide, please. So the last thing we wanted to do then is Roger, surprise, surprise, has trees and hedges as well. And this aerial LiDAR, if you see over on the left-hand side, this is actually a LiDAR image of a tree in full leaf. Even though the helicopter flew over, whatever it was, 2,000 feet. The technology is extraordinary, and but it allows you to actually measure how much biomass is in that tree, and then you can do a calculation. So what you can see in the main map there is Roger's farm, and you can see the sort of the yellow, the orange, the red. Okay, and if you go to the right-hand side, that is basically highlighting all the trees and hedges on this farm, and the red is where the hedges are below 3 meters. When you go right up into the yellow, that's between 6 and 9 meters tall. And so you can actually get a real handle on how tall is the biomass and actually measured. Next slide, please. So what we found when we measured this is actually on Roger and Hilary's farm, they had 7.2 kilometers of hedges below 4 meters. They had 1 kilometer of hedges between 4 and 7 meters. with 8.85 of a kilometre between 7 and 10, and in over 1 kilometre of hedges greater than 10 metres. And you can see there, when you add all that up, there are 241 tonnes of biomass, which is 120 tonnes of carbon. In trees, you can see in hectares, in single trees, deciduous woodland, coniferous woodland, and add that up. In total, these 332 tonnes of biomass above ground, which is 166 tonnes. So not nearly as much in his trees as in his soils, but still all adds up. Next slide, please. So just to finish off, just to give you a few ideas of the things we're looking at with Roger to improve the amount of carbon. The first one is to get his pH all up to 6.5. And certainly in Doubt, that's what we've done. We've transformed our soil pH over 6 years. We started at 5.5, we're averaging 6.6, and we're expecting when we redo our soil carbon analysis next year, we will find that it has dramatically increased the soil carbon. Next slide, please. The second thing we've done, we have put a huge research project in on multi-species swards. We've got 36 hectares in replicated trials on multi-species swards alongside perennial ryegrass and the old permanent pasture. We are co-grazing with beef and lamb on our multi-species swards. And after 1 year, we put all our data through SRUC's AgriCalc. And you can see there that our 12 species multi-species sward has reduced the greenhouse gas footprint per kilo of beef and lamb by 26% in 1 year. And that has come from two key things. One is we reduced the amount of nitrogen fertilizer by 65%, dropping it from 170 kilos per hectare to 70. We have improved our average daily weight gain by 20%, which is huge. Our lambs off the multi-species swards went to the factory 40 days earlier than our lambs off the perennial ryegrass. At the same time, we have dramatically changed the biodiversity in our soil. We've had a 300% increase in earthworms, and we've noticed that our rainwater is percolating through the soil up to 14 times faster. Really dramatic, and that's without us working out the increased carbon in our soil because of the herbs and the legumes. Next slide, please. And another area we're looking at, and it really builds on the success that AFBI's had, is actually putting our animals and trees together, which is an absolute anathema to 99% of farmers. But the reason we're interested is the science is really good. In the case of Silver Pasture and their 30-year trials in Loch Gold, they were able to treble the amount of carbon in that over that period of time compared to perennial ryegrass, which is extraordinary. But they also had huge increases in spiders and birds and beetles. And probably the most interesting thing is they also were able to extend the trafficability over the field, so you could extend grazing. In their case, they extended the soil trafficability by 17 weeks a year, so they could utilize more of the herbage. Certainly in Ireland, we find we can grow a lot of herbage. We can't always graze it because it's either too wet in the spring, too wet in the winter, or the autumn, or we get a very wet period in the summer. And certainly that has greatly helped as well. Next slide, please. So I just want to finish off, and I want to hand over then to some of the, hopefully some of the questions to Roger on the sheep side. We are passionate. We believe our EIP will deliver, all 7 farms will accelerate towards net zero. What we've done is we've personalized the agenda. All 7 farms now know where they are. They now know what they're emitting. They now know what they're sequestering. And together over this winter, we'll be working out what are the key things that they want to change. We've created the baselines for our carbon stock. We're sitting down one-on-one training sessions, explaining how to use this new digital data. But by doing that, this has empowered each one of us to make better quality decisions. And by repeating the baselines every 4 to 5 years, we'll know if we're on track to deliver towards net zero, which all of us are under pressure to do. But at least we've brought transparency. And if and when someone designs a carbon trading scheme, we have the ability to prove to people who want to pay us that we've actually improved the amount of carbon we have in our farm. So thank you very much.
Thank you for that, John. I found that very interesting. Probably 5-10 years ago, I would have fallen asleep through that and had no interest. But I think, yeah, it's very interesting for us now, and we're depending on science now to fight our cause on this one. That we're part of the answer. There's no point really in is there, Jason, going to specific questions, or will we just ask questions as they come?
Yeah, so I'll start putting out a few questions. I'm going to start with one for Roger, and while he's on, maybe the rest of the panel might like to turn on their screens. So Roger, what multi-species mixes do you use that still have a good day live weight gain for lamb growth?
Plantain, chicory, red clover and white clover, and 2 perennial ryegrasses was the mix we used. Seemed to do really well. Yeah.
And a question just following on from that is, how long do you expect those multi-species swords to last?
This is probably going to be my challenge. The first field I put it in a reasonably dry field, and it had, yes, there's less herbs in it than what there was at the start, but I'm still getting really good results from it. It was my best producing field in the whole farm, and one of the fields that got the least fertilizer. The second field I've put in now on Herbalife is on probably the wettest field on the farm, and it'll be interesting to see if it is going to last as well. Probably persistency is going to be a challenge for Herbalife, but we're learning as we go. So it likes to be grazed off, just not as tight as grass, and we're learning how to manage it and try and keep it as good as we can.
Okay, question for John Gilliland then. I'll actually ask two at once here. One question is, what will be classed as a respectable soil carbon level, and then how much carbon do you lose when you plough?
So there is no, there's no definition of what respectable is. What we're seeing in ArcZero, we've got 7 totally different farms, and they range from 60 tons of carbon per hectare to 400 tons of carbon per hectare. And it, you could say the bottom one is not respectable, but then again, the top one is pure peat. So we've got a complete range. I think the interesting thing, what we're finding, is because we sampled the woodlands and that we know the soils, in most of our cases, the soils in our woodlands are actually the same soils that are in the middle of the fields. We're beginning to get an example. The example I quote is actually from a dairy farmer, Ian McClelland, who's in our group. And so he's got an identical soil texture classification with his woodland, with his silage fields. In his silage fields, he's got 90 tons of carbon per hectare. In his woodlands, he's got 190 tons of carbon per hectare. And that's really interesting because the experts are telling us that soil, the amount of carbon the soil can store plateaus after 20 years. Well, what we're seeing certainly on these farms is that there's room to put a lot more carbon in here if we chose to do it. And one of the things I've challenged Ian, and Roger was there the night I challenged him, is if milk was 30p a litre and carbon was 100 pounds a tonne, how would you run this farm? Because at a carbon of 100 pounds a tonne, he would really have to look at why he's milking at all. And so it really depends where government takes us. And if they start paying us for carbon, we might approach what we do in a different way. At the moment, we only get paid for meat, we only get paid for milk. And So there's no straight answer what a respectable amount of carbon is. It really depends on your soil type. In regards, if you plough, yes, if you plough, you will lose carbon. And one of the things that really irritates me in the public debate at the moment is the loss of soil carbon and the loss of clay and soil while growing human edible plant-based food is not properly recognized in their attack that you should stop eating animals and that you should only eat, human edible plant-based food. So you do reduce your carbon. Now, what Darragh Fanara and AFBI is saying is if you reseed once every 5 years, the soil actually can cope quite well and recovers within the first 3 to 4 months. But if you're an arable farmer and you're cultivating every single year, the soil has no chance to recover and you quietly lose your carbon. And I know on my own farm, as some of you may know, I was a tillage farmer for 30 years. We reckon we lost probably half our soil carbon in 30 years of tillage.
Okay, thank you, John. A question for Aurélie. On the lowland trial, did you see any efficiency gains that correlated with the age of the ewes, older ewes being more efficient?
Yes, that's a good question. Once the ewes reached their mature side, we did see like a bit of a plateau in the efficiency. So there was an effect of the age. The age of the ewe was included in all our statistical model. So that was, taken into account. And I mean, it's not something we have reported specifically, but it'd be nice to look into. But it seems that I think from memory that there seems to be almost an optimal age at which maybe the efficiency is maximum, probably around between 3.5 and 5.5 years old, age mating as such. So it would be something we would need to look into more. So I think we will look into that. But there was an effect. It was significant in the models, but that was included. So that was taken into account in our final results as such.
Eric, question for you. A farmer looking for more advice around how a farm can monitor those L3 levels in pastures for pasture mapping. How would a farmer go about doing that?
Unfortunately, that's not really feasible. So you can count larval densities on pasture, but even for researchers, it's a huge job and is very skilled. So you can't actually count the larvae on your pasture, which is why we're putting so much effort into pasture contamination mapping based on predicted values from fecal egg counts and weather.
Okay, thank you. Okay, going back to John Gilliland, can you explain why Roger's beef and sheep figures don't add up to his total carbon? Also explain what tier 1 is versus tier 2 and tier 3 in AgriCalc.
So I'm going to start with the latter one first, because I actually don't have the figures in front of me to answer why it doesn't add up. It should add up. And you have to phone up Mr. SRUC and ask why it's not adding up. But tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, what do we mean by that? So when United Nations started on this journey in 1990, they set up the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change. And they dreamt up a set of rules which would measure all our greenhouse gas emissions. So basically what they do is, in the case of sheep, they add up all the sheep in the country, and then they say, well, those sheep emit so many kilos of methane. And initially they did that at an international assumption. They just said a sheep, whether it is in Ireland, whether it's in India, whether it's in New Zealand, a sheep is a sheep is a sheep. Well, as we know, there are many differences in sheep and they're not all the same. So what they did is they created a tier 1 emission factor. In other words, that was an international approach. They encouraged everyone then to research to go to tier 2. So what happened 15 years ago in the UK is DEFRA funded organizations like AFBI and SRUC to go off and physically put sheep in respiration chambers and physically measure them. And they came up with a UK approach. So it's now not an international fudge, it's a UK fudge. So that's called tier 2. Tier 3 is actually when you go and take sheep farm by farm, and you actually measure the sheep on the farm, and it gives you an accurate reading as an average for the sheep on your farm. That is what they call tier 3. So it gets more and more accurate as you go up the scale. And basically, the United Nations would like all of us to get to tier 3. So the emissions that SRUC use in the AgriCalc are all tier 2. There's an odd tier 3. I think they're all tier 2. But on soils, because government wasn't interested in measuring segregation, government was only interested in measuring emissions. And that's still all they report us against. So there's a big knowledge gap. And that's why we stepped in and Devonish to start measuring carbon stocks and remeasuring them every 5 years, so we could work out what a tier 3 segregation factor is, because we think tier 3 will better reflect what's on our farm, and we probably find we're sequestering more carbon. So the tiers are to do with accuracy, and basically you want to get to tier 3, and tier 3 will reflect better. So what we're hoping after 5 years in Roger and Hillary's farm is we will have a tier 3 emission factor for his soils. And that means then if Roger improves it, he can get the benefit of it. And that's really what we're trying to do.
Okay, thank you, John. Question again for Aurélie. Do you think in time we can get to the days, we can get the days to slaughter down while keeping the ewe size small? My days to slaughter are reduced by 2 months in the past few years, but the ewes are just getting bigger every year.
Yeah, well, that's why we need to really keep a good eye, you know, on getting control over the ewe weight. So I think it's possible, and in a way, that's what we wanted to achieve with those crossbreeding strategies. So if you keep on selecting, I think you can make sure it doesn't increase, you know, that you stay in control of not having too heavy ewes. So it's not a clear answer. I hope and I think it's possible, but you need a lot of data to make sure that you keep track of that.
Okay, a question for Eric here. I don't know if John wants to comment on his experience, but John Martin, regarding anthelmintics, how much of a growth check are you likely to see in either cattle or sheep by not dosing them?
Well, I suppose it's, you know, we're still probably not brave enough not to dose in terms of, you know, in the first year of young lambs, for example. I know certainly other parts of the world they take a different approach in terms of, you know, not dosing and then using the ones that survive essentially or thrive to select their replacement stock from. So, you know, we potentially will see significant challenges certainly in those young livestock. On our farm, we've moved away from dosing adults completely. So after the first year, we're not dosing ewes at all, except for fluke.
Eric, do you want any points on that, or?
Yeah, I think it depends on when, right? So if you're dosing early in the grazing season, you're primarily doing that to reduce pasture contamination. And if you don't dose, you wouldn't expect a growth check because infection levels are low then. But what you will get is a greater pasture contamination later in the season. Later in the season, you'll get more of a growth check if you withhold on dosing. And that can be substantial. So that's what we're trying to avoid by being careful with our first year strategies.
Interesting question.
Jason, can I just add an observation? I said I know nothing about sheep, and I know nothing about sheep, but I observe. So we've got sheep on the 4 different species trials at Douth. None of our lambs in the multi-species ward have been dosed in the last 2 years. We still got them off on average 40 to 42 days earlier. We have been absolutely stuffed this year with anthelmintic resistance on the lambs on our perennial ryegrass. We've now dosed them 3 times, and they're a mess. I don't know what's happened, but this year we have been absolutely stuffed. And so our 42 days was, it's a 2020 grazing season, the 2021 days of grazing season. The gap is going to be far larger. I've never seen resistance like it that we have been hit with this year.
Okay, thanks, John. And actually, another question for you here, which I think is quite interesting, is what do you mean by when you say Roger will get the benefit of increasing carbon? Do you mean by monetizing the carbon in the offset market, or do you mean it will improve his productivity bottom line?
So I mean two things. First of all, both Roger and I participated in the DERA UFU Climate Change Conference 2 weeks ago. We, Lord Devon, who's the chair of the UK's Committee on Climate Change, made it very clear that at some stage farmers will be paid for additional carbon. We just don't know when, and he doesn't know when either. We did push him on it, but he absolutely felt that the only way that agriculture was going to get anywhere near net zero is farmers will be paid for additional carbon that they put in their soils. He was very clear on that. We just don't know when, okay? So what we're at least doing is putting science behind it, and also then going in and saying, if you're going to go down this way, this is how we do it, to make it practical so that farmers can actually engage in it and it can properly reflect the improvement. The second answer to that is soils that have ever-increasing carbon in them, actually on the whole are normally more fertile. They drain better, you need less inorganic fertilizers. So there is a performance benefit as well. The healthy soil is normally rich in carbon. You asked me a question earlier on about what is a good soil. If you've got a soil sitting down at 50 or 60 ton of carbon, it's either pure sand or it's getting close to sand. But the one thing for certain is it'll have no moisture retention and it'll have little nutrient retention either. So certainly for us, improving soil carbon will improve productivity. Also too, the earthworm population, people forget the earthworm is the most important animal you have on the farm. It really drives the soil biology. And so we will see productivity gains. Now, I have to say, Roger's topsoil is really stunning. I have to say, he's really, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Roger, you're utilizing over 13 dry ton per hectare per year of grass. That's stunning at 850 feet above sea level.
Okay, thanks, John. I think we're now coming up on 9 o'clock, and we said we wouldn't go with the 2 hour mark. So maybe there are more questions, but I think I'll hand back to Edward now to wrap up.
Right, thank you, Jason. Yeah, I'd just like to finish off this evening's event by thanking all the speakers for excellent presentations, for probably totally different presentations, but yeah, all very interesting. Yeah, and keep up the work. We depend on, our agriculture depends on the research and work that you guys are doing. There's been a good turnout tonight, and I should thank all those the audience that we cannot see, but you can see us, for your participation, for your questions, which has helped the evening. I should thank, well, Jason's one of the backroom boys, but he's at the front. A special thank you to Gillian's in there somewhere at the back working, Carrie Ann and her HDB team. This probably wouldn't be possible without them. So big thank you to all that was involved in front and behind the cameras. The final session tomorrow of the Sheep Breeders Roundtable is at 12 noon tomorrow, hosted by NSA, and the future is the breeding sheep for the future, genetics to meet the requirements of farmers, society and policymakers. I know by this stage, if it had been a normal Sheep Breeders Roundtable, the participants would begin to get a bit dozy, batteries would be getting flat, but that will not be the case this time, and hopefully you'll all be able to make it to those to that final event tomorrow at 12 noon. Just as we close, there'll be a survey come up on the screen, and it would be useful for the organisers if you would fill that survey in. It gives us an idea of your thoughts and what we did right and what we did wrong. So just to finish off, thank you everyone involved. Thanks a lot to everyone, and have a good evening.